Welcome back. Already lecture number 5, despite the fact that we started late. So today, as promised, a 2-split session, which means that I cannot let you go just like right after the lecture, because I would like to do a little bit of a group work, seminar, workshop style of stuff with you. It's not that much, so please don't run away. It's just like 2 small tasks that I would like to do live as well here in Clausthal, but also in a breakout room that Anand will moderate for the people who join us online. So first, short lecture on the limits to growth and planetary boundaries. Then we're going to look into a bonus episode that we're not going to record because this is a test and I'm not quite confident about the quality. And second of all, because it's about you presenting also some thoughts of your own, some other stuff, and I don't want to have this on the internet like just as a favor to you for the rest of your life, because I'm not asking you to present a perfectly well-researched thing, but just your thoughts that you have within 10 minutes. So we're not going to record that second part. That was a really good statement for that. Good. But before that, we first do our normal lecture. And before that, we go to updates. By the way, we do not have feedback on the exercises yet. The submission deadline was just a few minutes ago, and Teresa is on vacation, so we're going to talk about the exercise submissions next week. So, who followed the climate change thing? So last week, I said I'm going to record an apology video in case something like relevant happens there, or if they have a major breakthrough. One day later, I woke up to a headline on one of the news articles that said, okay, there was a major breakthrough at the conference, but in the end they just like donated 200 million, so not really a major breakthrough. And the last statement that when I checked that was online was that the president of the current climate change conference that is still going on in Abu Dhabi and Dubai, and which is headed, as we already discussed last week, by this nice guy who's also the CEO of the Abu Dhabi oil company, is not, in fact, interested in saving our planet, but just another climate change denier. He said there is no science out there that says that the phase out of fossil fuels is what's going to achieve 1.5-degree global warming. So essentially denying that there is a relationship between greenhouse gases and climate change. In his defense, this statement has a small amount of truth out there, because we're already way past the 1.5-degree global warming goal. Therefore, to phase out coal now is not going to help us to achieve that goal. So in that sense, yes, that is correct. Everything else is just blatant denial of science. Not sure why he might be not interested in phase out of fossil fuels. I guess it doesn't have anything to do with him being the CEO of the Abu Dhabi oil company. I think this is just like coincidence. Good, so I don't need to apologize, at least yet. So maybe we'll have another update next week when they concluded the climate change conference, but we'll see. Good, today we're talking about a little bit of modeling. So we're now going partially in the direction that some of the computer scientists might find quite intuitive, also the mathematicians who come up with the models behind simulations. Because when we talk about how does climate change influence how does climate change influence our planet, you're essentially talking about forecasts or prediction of a certain system. How does a system behave? Our planet is some kind of a system. There are parameters that you can play around with. They are highly complex. There are more parameters that we can even comprehend. But in the end, it's just a system that you can try to simulate. And when you then start tweaking the parameters, the system tries to, or will tend to behave differently depending on how you change the parameters. And when we talk about, okay, climate change is going to be bad because if we do this, X happens, or we can combat climate change or environmental pollution by doing A and then B will happen, we're essentially also just talking about simulations in that sense. And that's not really a new thing that happened. And today we're going to look a little bit closer into the background of those systems, going back very, very, very early, way before I was even born. So where we had the statement, we have a finite system, which is pretty much just a sandbox. We have some limited amount of resources in that system. If you throw out all the sand, you have a system that lacks sand. If you pee in every corner of your sandbox, then you have pee in every corner of your sandbox. If you burn all your toys, then you do not have any toys left, but probably some kind of melted plastic pollution in your sandbox. So it's a pretty simple system. And this is what we're going to start out with, that you might know from your biology class back in high school. If not, also not a problem, because it's simple, super simple example. The so-called Lotka-Volterra equations or simulations is where you often have this example of blue fox and red rabbits. And the idea is pretty much very simple. Fox likes to eat rabbit because rabbit very tasty. The more foxes you have, the more rabbits they eat. Once there is no rabbit left, the fox population starts to decline. That means for each rabbit, there are less foxes hunting them and less rabbits being lost, so the rabbit population goes back up, which then make sure that the foxes start to populate again because there is an excess of food. They lead all the excess of rabbits go down, and so on and so on. So essentially, it's a very simple example of a very simple system that you can put in an equation where you have two major parameters that you can change, and those parameters are the numbers of foxes and rabbits. And that's just going to be like a super simple start for what we're doing here, because we're going to make it a little bit more complex. Who has read or seen or heard of this book? No is absolutely fine. I mean, it's 1972. It's totally fine. So on one hand, of course, it's like part of the title of this course, but it's also a quite influential book that is very old, but still super relevant until today. And I stumbled upon this book when I was, 14, 15. And it's, on one hand, a quite interesting read, especially if you like math or computer science. On the other hand, it's also quite depressing, because what we have seen with the Lotka-Volterra equations one slide before is essentially what they did, and just slightly more complex for human beings. And as we've already talked about, we're somewhere in the downwards path that is not sustainable if we continue as we do right now. This is pretty much the story of that book. We're going to have a little bit, or have a look into the history of that book and the model and the simulation behind it, and what we can learn from this, but also what are the limitations of this model, of this book, what are critics, why you cannot take each and every statement made in this book as complete truth, because it is a simulation that was made in 1972, which is by now 50 years ago. So let's start with one statement that I took right from the book. So you can see the book is also available in German and like many other languages, but the original source in English. If the present growth trends in world population, industrialization, pollution, food production, and resource depletion continue unchanged, the limits to growth on this planet will be reached sometime within the next 100 years. The most probable result will be a rather sudden and uncontrollable decline in both population and industrial capacity. So that was a statement from 1972. When you think back to our last lecture, where we talked about the history of political inaction, this is also like about one of these very early statements. So we had this Keeling curve, 1958, if I'm not mistaken. We had the first climate environment conferences somehow popping up in the 70s, 80s, but then really taking off in the 90s. So they have also, not just from the climate change perspective and from greenhouse gases and CO2 being partially bad for us, and they have also argued and warned from a different perspective on this. So from the resource perspective and environmental pollution perspective, they do not even account for climate change in this model, because back then this was, as we already discussed last week, they had some kind of intuition there could be something about this, but it wasn't a fact as it is right now. So slightly different perspective than what we had so far. And this is the so-called World 3 standard run. So the book is called The Limits to Growth. World 3 is the simulation, the model that they analyze in this book. So it's a mathematical model, we'll go into the details here. And the standard run is the most commonly used configuration of this model. And in red, you have the resources that are available in 1900. And the model runs until the end of the 21st century. And when we use resources, they deplete. Some resources can be renewed, others deplete. So if you start with a set fixed amount of resources and you use them, they go down. Other parameters that you have here are food per capita. So how much food do I have per person over a certain amount of time? Initially, when I farm without any tech, then I can get less food per person out of stuff. If I suddenly start to use big tractors and machinery, I can farm more food per capita. Industrial output per capita also goes heavily up. You know this from the Industrial Revolution. And then you have tightly connected to those the population going up. If we're all doing well, like the rabbits do, then population goes up. If we start to do bad, population goes down. And the last parameter here is pollution. Pollution usually going up with population, because the more people we have, the more crap we create. And also with industrial output, there's usually a connection to pollution, but also extracting resources, food production, and so on. So there's pollution. And bottom line of the standard run here is we're gonna peak with our population at some point, and then resource depletion, pollution, and a breakdown in industrial output will cause a decrease, collapse, call it whatever you like, of the population until it at some point maybe stabilizes. That depends on how far you run the simulation and how you change certain parameters. We come back to that later. Something super important. There is a timeline where you say, okay, we start the simulation in the 1900s, and we're looking at this until 2100, to the 21st century, the end of the 21st century. But this is not time sensitive. This is just like a timeline. It doesn't say that this is where a population will collapse. I would like to stress it, because whenever you Google the limits to growth, or when you see discussions about that, there's often the confusion about the time sensitivity of this model. It doesn't predict when a collapse will happen or if it happens. It's just a simulation. It doesn't give you a timeline. So please don't say to yourself, look, it's far in the future, not my problem. This could be earlier, it could never happen, or it could happen exactly at the time that they predicted. So just making this very clear. So, go. Very good question. So just repeating for the audio, why is the industrial output collapsing when the population still grows? Why are foxes still going up when rabbits are already almost gone? Because there's always a little delay. For example, like, okay, you get pregnant and then child drops out later. For example, Ukrainian war. Now you're probably making less babies than you did before, but you still have a 9-month delay. But you also could think about like the past economic crisis that we just had in 2008, like financial crisis and then subsequent events later, COVID. You still had a rather stable population. You just had some shock events that overall can lead to a decline, but don't necessarily mean that the population already breaks down. So you need to cross a certain threshold so that everything breaks down. And the second question?
Why the food per person doesn't grow back when the population drops down? It doesn't grow so much.
So question is, why does the food per capita doesn't grow back to a level where it was before when the population drops? So it slightly recovers. One interpretation could be that food per capita is highly correlated with the technological advances of your society. If you cannot get back to the technological level that you had before a collapse, then you cannot produce as many food as possible before. Another aspect is here, you have a highly polluted environment, which makes it more difficult to grow food. We've talked about this example of Goslar, Rammelsberg just outside. Once you have reached a certain amount of pollution, you have a problem. Another resource that went down is fertile soil. Once you have depleted the fertile soil and it washed away, or if you reached a certain amount of desertification, you suddenly do not have enough farmland to grow enough food anymore. So some things that we are facing right now are all encompassed in your question. Thank you. Good. Wait. So first iteration of this book being published 1972. Now we're 2023, and there have actually been update reports being published. So there have been a 30-year update. There have been update before that. You can find them, where they have fine-tuned the model with new insights, but also have looked back at the model. How well did it perform in predicting a future? Or how closely does it resemble what we're doing right now? And also when we're getting back to the different configurations of the model, because I showed you the standard run now. There are also like different ways of running the simulation. That it's also like important to see, okay, where are we now in this model, given all the possible configurations? And also like a very nice read to get a better understanding. By the way, they're also like all like those books are very, they are not super complicated, high-end scientific publications. They are very like, you can read this in an evening. It's not really super complicated. It's quite straightforward. You will see in a second why, because the math behind this is on one hand sophisticated, but also it's 1972, so computers weren't that big back then, so it's quite simple. So complex and simple at the same time. You can also just take the model as it is by clicking on those links. There are different, in a second, different implementations of this World 3 model out there. So those are just 2 links. You can also go and find other sources yourself. Yes?
The hyperlinks doesn't work at the PDF as well as the website.
So those 2 don't work. Okay. Anand checking and creating. Where is the bug report? Okay, so we do not have this on the recording all the time. So there might or might not be a problem with those 2 links. We will further investigate this matter, but still thanks for raising this point, because that would be a problem. I think I tested them also, but maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I also just had them in my cache. But please play around with this model. This will actually be in fact part of your homework, playing around with the model. Good. Before we go into the history of the actual World 3 model and the math behind it, I would like to make a short detour to the concept of so-called planetary boundaries. We briefly touched that topic in the intro sessions when we talked about the Earth overshoot day and the biocapacity of a planet. So there is a certain amount of resources that we can take per year from our ecosystem. Some of them will be replanted, will grow back like trees, and we can also cause a certain amount of pollution that our ecosystem can sustain without it breaking down. And we said, okay, the amount of resources I can take and the amount of pollution I can cause within a year without causing any major decline is the biocapacity. And the Earth overshoot day was then the measurement to figure out, okay, how soon did we deplete the resources or the biocapacity of this 1 year where we are right now? And I think we're at something like July for this year. So that means starting in July, at some point in July, we started living on credit for the next year, and we're doing this now for quite a few decades, that we're essentially just accumulating a huge amount of ecological debt. So planetary boundaries being very much related to this concept, just providing you a slightly different perspective. It has been first proposed in the early 2009, and the idea is to have a quantitative expression of what I just told you. So it's quantitative planetary boundaries within which future generations can continue to exist. So how much can I take away? How much do I have left? And when we talk about this Earth overshoot day, it's a very, like we reduce this to one number. Like when is the date we overshoot the resources that we can take away? It's like a huge simplification. Obviously, it doesn't really matter if you're off by a day, but from one resource, you might be like depleting that resource like, I don't know, 2 days after the year started, while other resources are available in such amounts that you will not deplete them within a year. So you get the idea. It's like, it's not really accurate. It's very much simplification. And the planetary boundary is trying to make it slightly more sophisticated, or like giving you more insights into different parameters, but also still staying super vague, because otherwise we would have to do a whole lecture series just on that and not skipping over it as an intro to today's lecture. So They have 9 indicators that are of high importance for the stability and resilience of the Earth system. And crossing those boundaries increases uncertainty about humanity's future. So that's like the long story short. And those are the planetary boundaries with the 9 indicators that they raised. Freshwater, land system change, biosphere integrity, climate change, novel entities, stratospheric ozone depletion, atmospheric aerosol loading, ocean acidification, biochemical flows. Please don't ask me about the exact nature of each and every of this indicator, because I would also need to look it up. For example, stratospheric ozone depletion is not my field of expertise to just highlight this right away. But I wanted to introduce you to this concept and the fact that it's not just one single variable. And we have a color coding for the next slide. Green means we're below the planetary boundaries for this particular indicator. Yellow means red means problem. And this is what we have for 2022. We didn't update for 2023 yet, but we'll probably do so for next year. So green freshwater use seems to be more or less fine seen on a global level, but we talked about droughts being a major problem in some places and not a problem in other places, but also the harsh difference between having suddenly too much water and then for a long time too little water. But in average, which is like looking over a year, there seems to be no freshwater use problem according to the planetary boundary concept. Land system change being more a problem, biosphere being a fucked up example, and some other things where we couldn't really give you a proper answer yet because the indicator development was unclear or didn't provide a good answer there. So for example, for atmospheric aerosol loading, I saw also one where it wasn't green, but we decided to leave it out there. Same goes for the other biosphere integrity measurement. So just grabbing the concept, not becoming an expert on all those indicators. So planetary Earth overshoot day, one indicator. Planetary boundaries, slightly more complex. Why am I telling you this? Because now we're getting even more complex with the World 3 model. So when not only going back to 1972, when it was published, but going even further back into history, into the 1960s, to a guy called J. Forrester, who was at MIT and developed something called system dynamics. For the computer scientists among you, you can still find this. It's a modeling language. It's a methodology and a mathematical modeling technique that he primarily used to understand nonlinear behavior of complex systems over time. And he used it to create something that was first called World 1, and then later Forrester created a model called World 2, and you can probably guess that World 2 is the predecessor of World 3. The system dynamic modeling starts with defining so-called levels, which we will most likely call stocks, so stocks of certain resources that you have, and then their rates or flows. So let's say you have resource water, you're getting some water out by using it, but also it rains, so water comes back. So you have a stock of water and then flows, let's say how much goes in, how much goes out. You could say the same about humans, because some die, others will be born, and then you have birth rate and death rate. And depending which religion you follow, you might even have being reborn and thereby creating a nice cycle. So stocks, flows. And then you have a so-called laundry list, which specifies influencing factors for each of the rate variables. So for population, birth rate, death rate, for money, income, and expenses, and you can continue that list for a while. What goes into the laundry list for the birth rate? Population influences how many people are born. The standard of living, if the standard of living is very low, might have a different birth rate than a very high standard of living. Food quality, food quantity, education against very important contraceptives. Do I have access to contraceptives? Relevant question in the chat? Okay, thank you very much. So, stocks, flows, laundry list. And with that model, the World 2 model, he came up with a certain approximation of what you've seen to the World 3 thing, but wasn't quite there yet. But it was interesting enough that the so-called Club of Rome, a non-governmental organization, invited Forrester to apply his idea to the global economy and the ecosystem. He said nope, but one of his students or colleagues said, yep, gonna do that. The guy is called Dennis Meadows. And when you Google the book and the Club of Rome, you will notice that there are two Meadows, Dennis and his wife, whose first name just escaped me, but there are two Meadows, both working on this, so don't get confused, or don't let yourself get confused by that. And Meadows and 17 other researchers spent a year refining and enlarging the Forrester World 2 model, calling it World 3. So more complex, more powerful. Better results? That's a big question that we will cover in a second. And they had 5 major model components that you can also see in the standard run that I also already showed you. Like you had 5 different parameters going up and down. Those major model components are those same 5 things. And this is a very simplified model that shows you the relations between those different components, plus indicating something like a positive feedback, minus is indicating a negative feedback. But this is just a simplification. The actual model is way more complex. There are roughly 150 equations in there, which is huge for 1972. It's a joke for nowadays, for nowadays models, obviously. We have these 5 main sectors. We cover the period from 1900 to 2100, and it's written in a language called Dynamo, which is essentially system dynamics. So when we look at those 5 components, population being the first, what do we consider there, or what's the most relevant thing to consider? First, people, which is our main stock here. And then you have certain control mechanisms to consider, like birth rates, death rates, maturation, carrying people from one age category to the next, because you're not really contributing a lot to industrial output when you're a baby that has just been born. You're also not really contributing something when you're 90 years old. Sure, there is like some relation between being a 90-year-old people still contributing to the economy by being a consumer, but you get the idea. Like depending on where you are in your life, there's a different contribution that you make, for example, to industrial output, but also to the other parameters. Usually you don't get children anymore when you're 90 years old. So therefore the birth rate is negatively affected by you being 90 years old. Agriculture being another component. So there you're mostly concerned with arable land, so land that you can farm. Control mechanisms, or the most important control mechanisms that you have here is how much new land can I cultivate and how much land do I lose, either due to erosion, urban development. I'm not sure if they had soil, like the fertility, the loss of fertility of soil already in that model, or if this is something that came in later. But like those being the most important for food. Industry measured in, or expressed in capital, here in US dollars, representing factories or other productive facilities that produce something. And then you have as control mechanisms, investments, input and outputs, and depreciation, because if you build a factory or a house, at some point you need to renovate it, so there's some kind of depreciation in there, and also some outflow. And, right, there was something missing. And when you then click the start button, you get the standard run that I already showed you. But there is a big, big problem with those kind of models that are also often ignored. And this is essentially then expressed in Forrester's dilemma. So you can look at stuff that happened in the past and use it as an input for your model. And then you click start. The closer you are to the prediction that you make, the easier it is to predict what's going to happen. So that was simple to predict. But the further you go into the future, the more difficult it becomes to predict what happens. So I could predict that you're probably like, there is a bottle cap flowing at me. But for example, it was more difficult to predict now whether you would scream at me, run out of the room, throw something back. And the more we now talk, the more complicated it is to predict that. So the further you go away, the more uncertain is what you can predict. And also, the more into the future you look, the more the actual things that happened depending on your parameter configuration can change. And this is something that we already briefly talked about in the context of the CO2 emission pathways, where I said, okay, if we limit our emissions to this threshold, then we have an 80% probability that it goes this way. If we do not do anything, then we have a 100% probability of being fucked. So depending on how you set your configurations, you can have widely different outputs, but you also get more and more uncertainty the more you look into the future. So predicting the very near future, mostly being trivial. Predicting the far future, more and more difficult. So please keep that in mind when evaluating the World 3 model, but also when someone gives you any kind of predictions. So I showed you the standard run. There were 3 more scenarios based on various assumptions that they calculated or simulated. So the standard run, which is also often called business as usual. Then, yeah, so you've seen that before, so nothing new here. Resources go down, population, industrial output go up to a certain point, food, pollution dropping at some point. So we've talked about this. This is called business as usual. So you could now look at this model and say, where are the problems? Because you might not want to die. So what do we have to fix? So is resource depletion maybe the biggest problem that we have? So let's either try to find more resources, colonizing Mars, finding resources where we haven't been able to extract them, like the floor of the ocean or the ground of the ocean, or going into recycling, which then also gives you something like an indefinite resource pool. And this is where, so it essentially collapses due to natural resource depletion. And so the next assumption for the next simulation was then, okay, let's double the natural resources. Let's double all the stuff that we had. So let's see what happens then. So it's really the resource depletion, the problem that we had here. Because if we just do a circular economy, where we do not lose any resources, what's going to happen then? Which is called the business as usual 2 model. So we have way more resources. We still use them. So they go down. Industrial output loves having more resources. Population also goes to the roof, but there's still a certain decline. And similar to before, industrial output goes down and food goes down at some point. What also goes through the roof and never goes down is pollution. Because now that we have more or less indefinite amount of resources, or at least double the amount of resources, we're suddenly getting stuck in an environmental pollution dilemma. We're producing so much, we're becoming so many people that in the end, we do not have an environment left that we can use to survive. Yes, please.
Is the pollution point like what we produce until pollution in this year, or what we have now?
An accumulation of all pollution over the runtime of this. So essentially adding, okay, this year I caused 1 pollution, next year I caused 1.1 pollution. So essentially accumulation of pollution.
Okay, so like when we see 2000, we don't look at what we did before. We only look at what we're doing this year.
No, the accumulation of what happened before. So it's similar to when you use resources. When I give you, you start the model with 100 pieces of gold. And initially you take only like half a coin of gold and 1 coin of gold, but the amount of gold that you took accumulates, it adds up. And the same goes for the pollution. First you only throw this 1 bottle cap out of the window, and then over years more and more bottle caps show up there. So it's an accumulation in addition of the pollution that happens.
But why is it dropping on the first page when you go 2 pages back?
Because you have a certain biocapacity. You have a certain capacity to process pollution. So when I put too much fertilizer into a pond or into a lake, first I have algae blooms, complete breakdown of an ecosystem. At some point it normalizes because all the fertilizer has been used, and then over time you can get back to a normal functioning ecosystem if you didn't go too hard. And that's pretty much what's also modeled there.
So the pollution will also drop in the future.
Yeah, but it's probably, but not before this point where it went out of the scale. Or it could actually reach a point where pollution becomes, because the example of the lake that I just gave you, where we can come back to a normal, only works under certain assumptions. When I not only just put too much fertilizer into that lake, but I don't know, go completely ham and nuts with all the potential pollution that I can think of for this one lake, then I can actually really destroy an ecosystem and make sure that it never ever recovers. So it depends. Good, so now we have a collapse due to pollution, which you could make a reference here or make a connection to saying, okay, you can say this is a climate change equivalent. Here it explicitly doesn't account for climate change, but you could see climate change as a similar example here. But it's not explicitly climate change, so please don't confuse. Good. So now we've figured out, okay, it's not a lack of resources, it's also a lack of how do we handle the waste that we create. So now we're getting closer to the circular economy thing, and in order to a circular economy that we haven't covered yet, because we're gonna do that in the next few lectures, we have to figure out, okay, how can we best handle those problems? So how can we maintain our resources without losing them? And how can we handle the waste that we're causing? Usual answer to that is technology. So we take the business as usual 2 example and add the assumption that we have exceptionally high technological development and adaptation rates. So we're not only having technological breakthroughs, but we also adapt those breakthroughs so fast that they essentially more or less immediately spread within society. So think about electric vehicles. They have been around for a while now, and there is a slow adoption rate. Here in this scenario, we assume more or less instant adoption. So it's not like, yeah, some people buy an electric car, everyone goes from combustion engine to electric car more or less immediately. That's the slightly exaggerated assumption here. What happens? Well, looks slightly better, right? So resources still go down until they stabilize on a certain level. The industrial output drops at some point, but also stabilizes. Food has a very small dip, but then goes back up. And pollution also doesn't seem to be a major problem. So this looks already quite good under the vague assumption that we have double the amount of resources that we are aware of, and that we have high technological breakthroughs and a more or less immediate adoption rate. But we're getting somewhere. We're really leaning ourselves far out of the window, but we're getting somewhere. So this looks quite nice. There's a minor crisis, but otherwise we're fine. At least until the end of this model prediction. It doesn't tell you anything about what happens afterwards, because we're stopping in 2100. So the only problem is we have rising costs for technology, and they could eventually cause a decline, but not a collapse. So this is like this drop that you can see here, because it becomes more and more expensive to run all these technologies. We'll come back to maintenance cost and what that means in the second part of today's lecture. But the more tech you have, the more high tech you have tech, the more costs you incur while developing them, while setting them up, then rolling them out to 8 billion or 10 billion people, and then also maintaining them. So, and the fourth example, or the fourth model, the fourth scenario that they created is a so-called stabilized world scenario, where you build on top of all these crazy assumptions that we already have, and then also say, look, we're also going to have changes in societal values, like, okay, we need less or something like this, and priorities, so that people are actually more interested in not consuming as much as possible, but be more sustainable. And this then looks rather similar to what we had before with the CT scenario. There are just less harsh drops in between. So there is a very little drop in industrial output. There is a very small drop in food, but population more or less goes stable, and everything else also remains stable at the end of the 21st century. So this would be among, like, given all those crazy assumptions, a rather favorable scenario compared to what we had before, where we had like significant drops that more or less crashed to zero when collapse happened. So this is what we're looking forward to. So how do we get there? And this was essentially then the point of the book, saying, okay, look, what we do right now, the standard run, doesn't seem to provide us a very nice future. Just getting more resources also doesn't seem to cut it. So what do we need to do? Okay, CT, more tech stuff, and then also changing our values seems to do it, given the best of our, like, to the best of our knowledge. So please do that. Here are our recommendations. And this is essentially like the point of the book, and also what the Club of Rome then subsequently did in its work. And they've done this since 1972. If they would have adopted all of this, I wouldn't be here, we wouldn't have this discussion. So obviously, they didn't really get where we wanted to be. Good. Question to you. Which of the 4 scenarios is closest to our current situation? We can do a poll online. You can log in if you like. You can also try to do something with raising hands, but online would be easier. That also gives you like 10 seconds or 20 seconds without me talking to you. Maybe I should get this bottle out of the camera so that YouTube is not arguing that I'm doing hidden advertisement here. So, so 8 people in the live audience. So 6 responses is not enough. So either you're thinking really hard or some responses are missing. And how?
So I didn't get it.
Can you restart? Okay, so for all of you online, we have to restart the poll because when people joined too late, sorry, that's my fault, then they couldn't participate in the poll anymore. So sorry about that. So second try. Please ignore what other people did before. You are supposed to answer this question for yourself. Doesn't really make sense to just follow the masses. This is what led us into this mess. Five, 4, 3, 2, 1. So 6 votes for business as usual, 3 votes for business as usual too, and then there are some optimists who hope that we're already in the stabilized worlds scenario, or at least in the comprehensive technology scenario. If we would have been in the stabilized world scenario, we wouldn't be here having this discussion. So it's just like a teaser. Okay, I need to present the right spec. Thank you very much. So unfortunately, it is not the stabilized world. It's also not the comprehensive technology. It is actually the business as usual 2 scenario. So we're supercharging, so what we're essentially doing is, without having twice the amount of resources, we're still acting like we would have, thereby supercharging all the stuff that comes here. This is at least what, when you compare like the initial predictions to where we are now on this scale, like when you run it, this is where we are. But compared to this timeline, 1972 to 2023, now it's like 50 years. Okay, that's an obvious, like a good prediction. But as we have seen in Forrester's dilemma, there are still 80 years left here. And the more we go into the future, the less certain the prediction becomes. So especially this part here in the background is like a very uncertain prediction range. It makes sense what they predict there, but still it's uncertain. So, World 3 and sustainability. So what the model clearly indicates is that we're already consuming resources at a faster pace than the planet is able to regrow or regenerate. So the inflow rate, the laundry list for those stocks. The conclusion being the standard of living is not sustainable, and that that we have like problems with the limiting factors. So just by adding more resources, we're not getting there. Just by adding like certain measurements that just tackle pollution, we're not getting far because then we're still running out of resources. So we need like a comprehensive solution. We cannot just start tinkering with certain parameters and hope that this gets us where we want. So in those books you will find more scenarios. Those are just the 4 important scenarios that I gave you here. So you can like clearly see when you just start tinkering with one parameter one by one and then trying to solve this problem like a 5-year-old, you're not getting somewhere. So you need a more comprehensive and complete solution. And this is why stabilized world, also in this simulation, gives you the best results. Good. Now I told you that this model is great, but there's also obviously criticism. One criticism being that it was developed in the 1970s, even though it was updated later on, but it's still like a very, very simple model. Trying to model the world in 150 equations leads to uncertainty. And it's like you cannot model the whole world in 150 equations. I can probably not even model one of you in 150 equations. That would be a quite generous assumption. So like this being among the main criticisms here. Another would be that even if you have 150 equations, that doesn't mean that you get all the input, like the laundry list rates, correct. Also, if you even got all the correct inputs, like maybe you forgot a certain input that turns out to be quite relevant, but you forgot it, or you were not able to model that. In 1970, the amount of information that you had was limited. Like if you wanted to get the birth rate, the global birth rate for something, you couldn't just ask ChatGPT or go to Wikipedia. So information were partially outdated, or you could not 100% rely on them, but you needed to put something in the model. So put yourself in the like in the perspective of someone in the 1970s trying to build something that ChatGPT would probably maybe it would even struggle with that, but you get the idea. Like modeling the world in the 1970s without all the fancy stuff that you now have is quite challenging. It leads to a lot of simplifications. And even the authors, the creators noted that. There's actually a complete book that they wrote dedicated to criticize the model. It's actually even longer than the actual book, so they are aware that there is a lot of things to discuss. Yep.
But why aren't we talking about like a model that is created with ChatGPT nowadays?
Again, please.
Why don't we talk about a model that is created nowadays with ChatGPT and all this information?
So ChatGPT. So the question is why are we not talking about a ChatGPT based model or ChatGPT created model with more recent stuff? First of all, ChatGPT was maybe a bad choice of word, because I don't know if ChatGPT actually could do something like this. Whenever I talk to ChatGPT, I often get very frustrated, or I always get very frustrated, because whatever I want, it cannot provide, because it seems to be very limited in its capacities. There are actually, of course, like simulations, but like what the IPCC report people are relaying on. But a lot of simulations now, or most simulations, all simulations that I'm aware of, they are now focusing on sub-problems, because when you try to create such a model, but with today's accuracy, you're suddenly getting to a point that this is for all, if you want to simulate everything, that you're getting into complexity problems. The interrelation between all those different complex systems, but also just the sheer computing power. So they start to, what you do, you break it down and start researching those things that you want to get an answer for. So how does greenhouse gas increase in the atmosphere affect the lifespan of penguins? Or how does it affect the albedo effect on ice and other stuff? So you start to break it down, because the complexity otherwise gets too big if you want to model everything. So there is no model of everything. It only works into a certain amount where you have limited equations and limited input. And there are other models, but this tends to be quite accurate. We'll come to that in a second. But also simple enough to explain it. And it's like essentially the starter for all those modern climate simulation models that they use nowadays. It's essentially the inspiration for that. So it's the predecessor of cutting edge research. Good. The 1972 book also did not contain the actual equations, but they published them. So it's not like they are hiding them. And they put them in the 1974 book later on. It's also heavily criticized by economists because the money model questions the fairy tale of eternal economic growth. Because so I studied banking and finance before. I got kicked out and I failed. So I'm not a good economist by no means. But what we discussed many times before with the sandbox example, if you have a finite system with limited resources and you're acting like eternal economic growth is a thing, you get into problems. So that makes economists unhappy, to simplify it. There's also criticism that is related to aggregated variables. So this is also why we talked about the Earth overshoot day as a one variable thing, then comparing it to planetary boundaries where I have 9 indicators. They did the same here. One resource. They did not specify water, iron, fresh air, CO2, whatever. It said, okay, one resource, one food, one pollutant, one population. Clearly, those are like simplified aggregated variables. And this is why we talked about the other stuff before. There's also no geographic structure no social distinction. There's a lack of statistical analysis, like no error bars. This is why I showed you Forrester's dilemma. Like, where are we in this range of uncertainty? And they are accused of being either too complex or of oversimplification, depending on what both is true. On one hand, their model was complex back then, and partially too complex to fully understand it. If you look there, there are nice illustrations online where they drew all the different components and how they affect each other. That looks fucking complex. But on the other hand, as I said already, it's an oversimplification of the real world. And you will have this essentially for all simulations. Either or everything that is sufficiently accurate is going to be super complex. If it's easy to explain and easy to do, it becomes more simple but less accurate. So when they ran the model with updated values and compared them to what happens after 30 years or subsequent updated model iterations, they came to the point that it's quite accurate and that we're actually like worse than the standard run, more closer to the business as usual 2 run. But we're still in this very early phase for the model interpretation that you can say, okay, yeah, it was rather simple to predict that. The more interesting prediction part starts now. So another 20 years from now, it would be more interesting to look into this model and see, okay, what actually, how well did they do? You can now start to discuss the accuracy on and off and try to find like, okay, how far are they off? How good is the estimation? Why do we not have a more complex model? Or take a step back and then think about, okay, what's the implication here? Does it really make a difference if I look at the standard run or the business as usual 2 model? If they are off by 10% or even 20%, does this really make a difference if we have 20% more time or less time? Or is the overall statement or the overall result that you get from interpreting this model what matters? Is a 20% difference or even a 50% difference, does it make a difference in this model? 50% probably at some point, yes. But you still have this problem of a finite system that we're over-exploiting, that we're over-polluting, and you can essentially see where this is going. And yeah. So what did we have in this first part today? First, quick look at planetary boundaries, then the World 3 model, then the 4 most commonly used scenarios for the World 3 model. We noticed that we're more closely to the business as usual 2, and we would like to rather have the stabilized world. And we also talked about some of the criticism for the World 3 model. Some of them I gave you like in an oral statement, others also were on the slides. We'll update it in the future. And that's it. Sorry, it's not exercise 5, it's exercise 4. For the actual lecture part now. Exercise 4, not 5, is going to be your homework for this week. It's probably a ChatGPT-able homework, so if you don't want to do it, please don't do it. It's fine. Please don't send us ChatGPT inputs. Have a look at the 4 major or commonly used scenarios that we discussed. What actions and which policies could we, humans, politicians, act upon to move the simulation results of the World 3 model towards the stabilized world scenario? Identify 3 proposals and describe each of them in 3 or more sentences. One of the reasons why I'm so frustrated with ChatGPT is that I tried to get meaningful ideas or inputs from ChatGPT on this that go beyond high-level blah blah bullshit that I get from everywhere. So give it a shot if you like, but I wasn't really satisfied with what ChatGPT provided me. That's it for the actual lecture part. I would say we're going to do a 5. Let's maybe make a 10-minute break. 10 minutes break, so 14:25. Then we're going to start with a few more slides and group work, and a few more other slides, group work done. It's not going to take for ages, but it's take a little bit longer than usual, but this is probably the only time where we take slightly more of your attention than we did before. Good. Still, even though we are now doing a little bit of extra content later on, you can also already drop your questions in the chat, and then we'll try to answer them as quick as possible and as accurate as possible once we're done with the extra content. Thank you very much, and see you in 10 minutes from now.